So, here we are in week 3 of our study of the book of Ruth. And it's at this point that we come across some difficulties, some issues in the story. It's at this point that if we were going to make a film, it would change in chapter 3 from the lovely Disney love story where everybody looks beautiful and romantic to carry on gleaning. This is the bit where it gets difficult if you want to simply say it's all wonderful. So far, Naomi and Ruth have travelled back to Bethlehem. They've come from Moab, and Ruth has managed to find food for them by going out and gleaning in the fields. It turns out that she's working in the field of Boaz, who is one of her relatives, although she didn't know that at the time. Ruth has just gone and she has been trusting that God would guide her. And they seem to have hit it off. Oh, lovely. However, about 2 months have passed. That's about the length of time for the 2 harvests that there have been. And at this point, Naomi proposes a plan that seems to me to be an attempt to shortcut the plan of God. And it's only because of the behavior of Boaz and Ruth that things actually work out well. When it comes to the text, some interpreters try to ignore the blatant sexual content in the story. They suggest that, this was a common cultural practice and underlying the actions that Naomi directed Ruth to take and that Ruth carried out. But the reality is we don't see that anywhere else in the Bible. In fact, we don't see it anywhere. Therefore, I think we need to take this text at face value. I don't believe that there is some unique cultural interpretation here. So what was Naomi's proposition? Well, imagine this wee scene as is acted out by me by 2 wee women. Ho hen! Aye, what? Gonna get yourself dolled up in that? What for? Because I'm sending you to get a man. You're gonna get a lumber. What will I wear? See you and wee top that goes, well, I wear it. That's kind of what's being suggested here. Hang on. So, Naomi suggests that she's only interested in Ruth's welfare. I'm doing it for your own good. I need to find you a husband. That's the next step, says Naomi to Ruth. I've got to find you a husband. I've got to find you a home. So it's put forward as being interested in her welfare. It's clear that she's determined that the husband should be Boaz. Even though he's quite a lot older, he's wealthy, he's got land, he's got servants. What a great match. So, it's also hard to believe that she didn't realize that she would gain something from that arrangement as well. Ruth has promised to take care of her. Ruth has promised to be with her. I'm not entirely sure it's really all about Ruth's welfare. But Naomi supplies one more detail, and it's that one there. And it's not put forward as a question. It's put forward as a statement. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. And if you have no idea of the cultural context, you go, and? So? What's the point of calling attention to that fact? Well, traditionally, at the end of the harvest, at the end of the winnowing, there was a celebration, there was a meal. And the folk would divide up, and the men would go and they would sleep around the area where the grain was to protect it. And the women and the children, having helped with the work, would go back to their homes. So, some people would want to suggest that at that meal Boaz would get drunk and he would have no idea what he was doing. I don't think it really suggesting that, but certainly when better to approach somebody about something. Your teenagers do it all the time. They wait till you're fed and watered. They wait till you're lying there on the sofa just about asleep, and they come in and they'll just hit you with it. When better? Because you're relaxed, you're happy, you're comfortable. So the implication here is that tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor, after which he'll have his nice meal, he'll have his wee drink, he'll be happy, and he'll be sleeping up there. Naomi's plan seems to assume that at that point he will be vulnerable, and she seeks to take advantage of it. As she reveals her plan, this assumption seems even more likely to be the case, because the plan is really simple. Ruth is to go and she's to bathe, she's to put on perfume and her best frock. She's to get dolled up. She's to go and present herself to Boaz at just the right moment, not too early, not too late, when he's really sound asleep, just at that right moment. And when nobody else is around, when he's had sufficient wine to be cheerful, and after he's settled down in bed, only then is she to slip under the blanket with Boaz, waiting for him to tell her what to do next. You see, that phrase, uncover his feet, has sexual connotations. The cognate, the root of the word for feet, is the same as the word for penis. And that phrase is used elsewhere with sexual overtones. Even the idea of making yourself known. The older versions of the Bible say, this buddy knew that buddy, and it meant they had sex, they had slept together. So that she wasn't to make herself known, could of course mean she wasn't to jump out and go, hello, it's me. Or it could mean, be careful about the time that you're going to have sex with Boaz. Many commentators, that's as we can go on one now, tried to suggest that in that culture it was a harmless symbolic request for marriage. But as I said, there's no other examples of that in the Bible. Others say that Ruth was simply changing from clothes that showed she was in mourning to normal clothes. That's what Naomi was talking about. Because somehow folk want to say this didn't happen. It couldn't possibly be like that, because there's a lack of purity in it all. This was to show that she was changing from mourning to normal clothes, and she was therefore ready to remarry. However, there are a number of issues with that. First of all, there is nothing to say that she was still in mourning. Naomi had already encouraged her to remarry, which might suggest that mourning was already over. All that time ago, when they were still in Moab, Naomi had said to her, go and find another husband. Go back to your own people and get married there. The second reason is, when Ruth was out in the field and Boaz came and said to his servant, who is that? Would they not at that point have said, it's Ruth, and look, she's still in mourning. She's still got her mourning clothes on. Thirdly, if she was still in mourning, if she was still wearing the mourning clothes, the idea that she would be molested out in the field is much less. There's much less danger of that happening because she's in mourning and not yet able to be married. And lastly, if her change of clothes was to indicate that mourning was over, why not do it during the day? Why would you do it in the dark and under a blanket? It just doesn't make sense that would be the case. However, Naomi's arguments seem to have persuaded Ruth at least to do some of what she had been asked to do, because she promises in the text to do all that her mother-in-law suggested. She's still committed and dedicated to Naomi. And while she agreed to do all that Naomi said, she didn't do everything in the way Naomi had suggested she should do it. Somehow Ruth and Boaz are able to navigate the moral minefield of the situation and come out unscathed. But all of it takes place no thanks to Naomi's meddling. I mean, can we honestly read Naomi's words to Ruth as the wise and principled counsel of a godly Israelite woman? Naomi's proposition is pure pragmatism, and it's patently wrong for the following reasons. Number one, Naomi proposes to solve a problem. You're okay, you just click, they're all on now. Number one, Naomi proposes to solve a problem in secret that should have been dealt with in public. Is the solution to this really best handled in the bed of Boaz in the middle of the night? Number two, Naomi's proposition is godless. In her words of advice to Ruth, there is not one mention of God or the plan of God or the purposes of God. Now, it shouldn't actually be all that shocking for us, because Naomi's first counsel on the matter was that Ruth should stay in Moab and marry in Moab and go and worship her gods in Moab. From Naomi's words, we would conclude that she sees Ruth's security as being in a husband rather than in God. Number three, Naomi's plan seeks to appeal to the baser instincts and impulses of Boaz, not his higher sense of duty. Naomi's proposition didn't encourage Boaz to do the right thing in the right way. It urged Ruth to seek a husband in a questionable and compromising manner. But fortunately, Boaz was committed to doing the right thing in the right way. And this is why he refuses to become intimate with Ruth that night, and why he gave the nearest kin the opportunity to do the right thing the following day, and we'll see that next week. Number four, Naomi's plan does not call for thought and reflection, but rather for impulsive and irreversible action. Marriage was not consummated as it is now by signing a bit of paper or by a minister or somebody, pronouncing you're now man and wife or all that kind of stuff. Marriage in those days was consummated by the sexual union of a man and a woman. And once it was consummated, it was quite difficult to get a way out of it. So Naomi's plan was to coax Boaz to become the family redeemer by having sex with Ruth. And once they had done that, there was no turning back for him. Number five, Naomi's scheme needlessly put the reputation of two godly people at risk. The words of Boaz in verse 14 indicate that if anyone had seen him and Ruth together that night, they would have assumed the worst. Two godly people would have been the subject of gossip as though they had acted improperly. Number six, Naomi's plan wrongly implied that Ruth needed to take the initiative in this matter of redemption and marriage, as though Boaz wouldn't have done it on his own. Number seven, Naomi's plan seems to assume that the end justifies the means. And lastly, nowhere in the book of Ruth is Naomi praised. Ruth is praised, Boaz is praised, but Naomi never is. Some of the older versions of the Bible say that Ruth did all that she was commanded to do by Naomi, suggesting that what was put forward as a suggestion was understood by Ruth as a command. She does all that she's commanded, but not, at least at that time, with the expected result. And then we have Boaz's promise. Boaz's promise. When Boaz realizes that someone is beside him during the night, he does the obvious thing and he asks, "Who is it?" At this point, Ruth was supposed to do whatever he said next. However, her next move was not to wait until he spoke and to wait and see what he said and do what he said, but to humbly and to modestly ask him to fulfill his role as the family redeemer. Her response to the inquiry of Boaz is a masterpiece in Ruth 3:9. He said, "Who are you?" "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." And these are very carefully chosen words. When Ruth identifies herself as the servant or maid of Boaz, she chooses a different word than she chooses earlier in the story. In chapter 2, verse 13, she uses the term for maid, and that speaks of someone who is very lowly, someone who doesn't deserve to be treated kindly and is of no real value. She considers herself, in that term, totally unworthy of the kind of treatment that she was receiving from Boaz when he looked after her and he gave her food. But now, this time, she uses a term that speaks of a maid who is much higher up the social strata, a class of maid who would be considered worthy and eligible to be married. So in a general sense, yes, she is asking Boaz to marry her, but more specifically, she's saying, I want you to be my kinsman redeemer. I want you to be the person who looks after me and after my family, who takes the name of any children or any son that we have, and who also will buy the land back for Naomi. She refers back to the words Boaz spoke in chapter 2, verse 12, when he says, May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. The idea of you spreading your garment over me is similar to the idea of the Lord spreading his wings over you. In other words, Ruth is asking Boaz to be God's answer to her prayer by redeeming her. That he will be the one who takes care of her. He will be the one who protects her. He will be the one who walks with her into the future. And I think that request and the way it was put is the noblest request made of Boaz. And he understands it as such. And then we have God's plan. Boaz acted with honor, and as we'll see next week, he is able to redeem Ruth properly and without any deceit. As a result, she finds a new identity and a new home. She became the wife of Boaz, the grandmother of a king, an ancestor of Jesus, because they did it properly. And there are lessons to be learned there. Number one, godly character is evident in ungodly settings. Godly character evident in ungodly settings. The godly character of both Ruth and Boaz is clearly displayed against the backdrop of chapter 3. Circumstances are far from ideal, but that didn't prevent these two people from living in a way that should command our respect. We all find ourselves in circumstances that are far from ideal, with people who don't know God, who don't honor God, and who try to get us to do things that we shouldn't do. And it is possible to live well. It's possible to do the right thing when we trust God and do what he's called us to do. The second thing to learn is that we should beware of ungodly counsel that comes from people who appear pious. Hang on. No, go back one and just leave it there. That's great. Beware of ungodly counsel that comes from people who appear to be pious and to have our best interest at heart. It's important to discern between good and bad advice. But how do you do that? Well, first of all, I think you need to consider the relationship of the person that you're asking. What is their relationship with God like? Naomi is not a woman who is walking close with God. By her own confession, she is bitter. She's accusing God of being unduly harsh with her. She's not in a place to be giving good, godly advice. So if you're looking for good godly advice, speak to somebody that you know is walking with God. Secondly, ask the question, is the counsel I'm being given coming directly from the Bible, or is it simply the opinion of another person? Now, that's not to say their opinion is not valid, and you shouldn't ever listen to somebody else's opinion. But if it's in the Bible, it's much better to say it's written here. That's what Jesus did when he was tempted. It's written, it's written, it's written. That's why we should read the Bible and learn it, because we can go back and get good, godly, wise advice from it. Then thirdly, we should ask, is the counsel being given challenging me to do the difficult, maybe even humanly impossible thing that is right, or is it justifying me in doing the easy thing that I really want to do all along? The third lesson is to be alert to the reality of the providence of God in the lives of his people. There is a text that we use very regularly, and many of you will know it and be able to recite it. It's in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and it says, "We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose." Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we don't see God's hand at work. We're in the middle of this storm. We're in the middle of this real difficulty. And we don't see that God is at work. We're maybe in a compromising situation. We don't see where God is. But it doesn't mean he's not there. It means we need to look even harder to find out where he is and what he's doing. And sometimes the providence of God is unseen until he chooses to lift the veil and reveal what he's doing. And then our text should teach us to be aware of taking shortcuts. It's my contention that Naomi is attempting to take a shortcut in her effort to get Ruth married to Boaz. I think shortcuts in life in that regard are both unbiblical and unwise. A shortcut, I think, is an ungodly, faithless action that we take to avoid pain or suffering, to avoid hard work, to avoid trusting God, or to avoid waiting. In other words, we take shortcuts in order to solve a problem the easy way, as opposed to God's way. And I want to give you just one or two examples of shortcuts that people took in the Bible. Adam and Eve took a shortcut. They eat the fruit of the tree that they were forbidden to eat, so that they would shortcut being like God. They weren't prepared to wait to get to know God. They took the shortcut. Abram and Sarah grew weary of waiting for God to give them the son that he had promised. So at the prompting of Sarah, Abram slept with Hagar, resulting in the birth of Ishmael. And even today, in the Middle East, we are suffering the consequences of that shortcut. Judah, afraid to give his third son to Tamar, and so Tamar took the shortcut of dressing like a harlot, a prostitute, and having sex with him. Fearing that they wouldn't be able to marry and to reproduce themselves, Lot's two daughters got him drunk and had sex with him, resulting in the births of Moab and Ammon. Moab, where Ruth came from. Ammon, the Ammonites, both of these peoples ended up fighting with God's people because they took a shortcut. Seeing his fighting men scatter, Saul went ahead and offered the sacrifices himself rather than waiting for Samuel as he had been instructed, and it was the end of his kingship. Fearing that they would suffer persecution from the Jews, some who claimed to trust in Christ began to insist that Gentile converts must be circumcised. And it caused huge division in the church. I can't find any shortcuts in the Bible that work out well. Jesus redeemed us. We'll talk much more about that next week. And he did it not by taking a shortcut. He said, at different points in his ministry, speaking to his disciples, I could have called down an army of angels. I could have done this, I could have done that, I could have done. But actually what he chose to do was be obedient to the will of his Father. He didn't take the shortcut. He didn't choose that way. He chose to be obedient, and he went to the cross. And he suffered there on the cross because his love endures forever. And that love was enough to make him obedient so that you and I could be redeemed. We don't need to take shortcuts. There aren't any. The only way that we can be redeemed is through faith in Jesus. There's no shortcut. There's obedience. There's love. There's grace. More than we could ever know. So this week, if you're tempted to take a shortcut, not be honest about your faith in God, whatever it is, remember, it's not worth it. it never works out in the long run. Be faithful, be honest, be upright, and let God do what only God can. Amen.